do a lot of teaching of business writing for Oregon State as well. So yeah, business writing is kind of my link here for why I'm on this panel.
It's your jam.
Yeah, it is. It is. I do a lot of business writing. I mean, obviously professionally as well, since I do some administrative work for the School of Writing, Literature, and Film. So I kind of come at it from both as a practitioner and as a teacher of business writing.
That's awesome. Sam, do you mind doing a quick intro?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm sitting up here in Salem, Oregon. I graduated from OSU. I got my BA there, my PhD from University of Arizona. I actually teach the craft beverage writing and marketing class that Paul was talking about earlier. So if any of you are in that field or know anybody who is, I think we're running it again, I think in the spring. So look out for that. It's a 4-week online course. I teach a lot of classes at OSU, but gosh, I've been teaching a lot of business writing and technical writing lately, and I like those classes a lot. I'm glad to be here.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much. So without further ado, we're going to dive into some of these questions, and I've sort of summarized them based on the themes, but I think I'm going to just kind of kick off, and I think there's going to be different perspectives depending on if it's technical writing or business writing, but we get questions around maybe what's the difference between the two. So there might be answers where from a technical writing perspective it's a little different than business writing, and it's all about what you're hoping to glean or what purpose you're really looking at for this writing. So let's start with how do you express complex topics in a simple way? So a couple of questions we got there is really exactly that. How do you go about expressing complex topics in a way that can be understood by a general audience? So let's start with, do you think, Claire, that would be a better, if that's what somebody's looking for, would they want to take business writing or technical writing?
My instinct would be to advise that person to take technical writing. I think a lot of technical writing is about figuring out how to express something that's highly technical to somebody who maybe doesn't have that technical background. But I'm curious what Rich and Sam would have to say, because they're the ones who are a little bit more involved with technical writing. So I'm curious if they agree with me on that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll chime in. I think with technical writing, I think one of the things that students are often, I guess, surprised at is when they realize that their own knowledge, which they have a lot of, or their area of expertise, when you go and try to communicate that, it's not as easy as you might think, because knowing something and being able to tell various audiences or write to various audiences about it are two totally different things. And so some students, whether they're professional learners or whether they're undergrads, come to it thinking, well, my knowledge will carry me forward here. This shouldn't be a problem. And then they start writing and they realize that you really have to concentrate, word to word, sentence to sentence. And that's, I think, what technical writing, it's a little more tied to disciplines. It's a little more tied to what you're actually doing, whereas business writing is more often about conquering those everyday communicative tasks, emails, reports, memos, and such, whereas technical writing will be more, probably a bit more directed at a certain, topic, usually, within your professional field.
And there's certainly some overlap, but I think that if you're really looking to hone your skills on simplifying something that's really complex, that technical writing that's kind of the essence, I feel like, of what that type of writing is.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's definitely true. We would teach in both classes, knowing your audience and trying to imagine who they are and what they need. And if they know a lot less than you, then that complexity really needs to be broken down, and you need to choose the essence of what you're trying to communicate. It means perhaps using metaphors. It means choosing your words very carefully. But if the audience is similar to you in terms of their knowledge, then you could get away with, a higher level of diction, or word choice.
disciplines.
Really, a lot of it does depend on, audience, obviously.
Yeah.
What if you have a mixed audience? What if you have folks that are maybe some of them are beginners and some of them are more advanced users? Sorry, Rich, I think you were jumping in on that one.
Yeah, I think actually that's a good like slight segue, because I think technical writing can be a really good example of that, because you are often aiming for a broader audience. And so I think in both cases, when you're trying to express these complex topics, Sam is right that rhetorical awareness, or which is what we call it, which is kind of what how you're defining your audience, how you think of your audience and what skills they're coming to the table with, that definitely comes into play. So if you're writing for people who are experts in the field and only people who are experts in the field, then you can use more technical jargon and things like that. But I think generally speaking with technical writing, especially, keeping things simple and straightforward can be an effective strategy. And I think that when you're using that kind of language, you can do it in a way that's going to reach a broad audience without being condescending. Because I know one of the questions that we had ahead of time was, how do I write for a broad audience without sounding like I'm talking down to the higher level people in the room? How do I, write for people who might be amateurs or beginners, but also who, might be the engineer, maybe they have a PhD or something like that at the same time. And I think there's a way to do it with simple language and without using jargon, in a way that is straightforward, but without being condescending. So I think that it's a delicate balance to strike, but I think that that's kind of, one of the core issues of effective technical writing and technical communication in general, that we kind of struggle with. So I think it's an area that's really ripe for kind of having that conversation. And I think it's the struggle of technical writers, like how do you strike that balance? I think it's kind of an ongoing thing.
Awesome. Thank you all for those responses. So I think sort of in this area of expressing the complex topics, can you touch upon maybe what's the difference between good and great technical or business writing? I think you can get to good, but what's really a differentiator to get to great?
That's a good question. I think
it is.
one of the things that is so interesting about that question is that I think for great technical writing, it becomes great when the reader doesn't even notice that it's great. It's working so well that they don't have to stop and think about the fact that they're able to follow the instructions in the manual perfectly with no trouble. I think we kind of tend to only notice it when it's not great.
Yeah.
And I think the same is true of business writing, actually. I think the stakes might be a little bit different. So somebody's probably, if they're reading a technical manual, they're maybe trying to complete a process. But when business writing breaks down, it can be maybe more interpersonal issues with like inter-office politics, that kind of thing. And we probably don't notice when somebody's tone doesn't annoy us in an email, right? If we get an email from a coworker, but we certainly notice when somebody's email does annoy us, like they haven't kind of taken care of our needs as a reader, and suddenly we have to go back and forth over email like 8 more times, then we notice it. Whereas if somebody was engaged in really great business writing, they would have figured out what our questions would have been ahead of time, and then we would have, maybe gotten by with just 3 emails back and forth rather than 8.
Yeah. That's definitely how I'm going to start organizing my inbox from now
on. I'd like to add in on that and say, I think also like the difference between good and great, it comes back to that awareness of your audience and putting yourself in their shoes, because, you can have a good email that, if you look at it from the outside and it looks perfectly professional and everything else, but that isn't even always necessarily what you need in a situation. I have coworkers that I've built a camaraderie with and who I'm close with, that sometimes a great email response might involve using a GIF, or might involve using, some inside joke from the office or something like that. And that can be rhetorically appropriate, but I probably wouldn't email the president of the university with that, or I probably wouldn't email my supervisor with that. So sometimes it can come down to kind of shifting your tone based on who's on the receiving end as well.
Yeah, definitely. Depending on the situation, I might include, an emoji or a smiley face, or I might kind of modulate the number of exclamation points I do or don't use, just depending on what I'm imagining my audience's reaction will be to whatever message I'm trying to deliver, whether it's good news or bad news or just something boring that I really want them to pay attention to. So yeah, I think, just keeping the audience's needs in the forefront of your head. That's the difference between good and great business writing and technical writing.
Perfect, thank you. Sam, I don't want to cut you off if you have anything else, but we can also, so ensuring clarity while remaining succinct. I like this. I think, how can I be concise in my writing? How? This was an important question for somebody. So what's the balance between communicating effectively and concisely, but still making sure that your message gets across?
Yeah, I guess I'll start that one. The first thing that comes to my mind, and this is sort of a grammar issue for me, is that people, well, students, but often I think just people in general, in the English language often use the passive voice instead of the active voice when they don't need to. Now, I don't have time to, lecture on the passive and active voice, but basically what the active voice ensures when you use it is that basically the sentence you're writing is subject, verb, object. And when you're using the passive voice, that order of that, the basic, core elements of the sentence get reordered. So the object becomes the subject usually, and then that requires adding in prepositional phrases. And so what it does is it balloons a sentence out. Now, if you don't know what I'm talking about here, if it's, you haven't heard these words, since junior high or high school, if you just were to type in active, passive voice into Google, there'd be plenty of sites that would come up to tell you what they are and then how to avoid the passive voice. The passive voice isn't technically wrong. It's just overused. And so what that does is it always balloons out sentences. So that's one of the first things I always, try to teach students and just anybody looking to be more concise. That's a pretty specific piece of advice, but that's always the first thing that I notice when I'm noticing that fault in writing.
Yeah, I definitely agree that passive voice is overused. I do think it sometimes has its place, but probably not as often as people use it.
Yeah.
One of my favorite exercises for improving the conciseness of writing is, it's maybe not the most fun, but you can sort of make it a little game with yourself just to practice. So what I do is I take a piece of writing, like a paragraph or, maybe 2 paragraphs, whatever chunk of writing it is I'm working on, and I will put it in a Word document. I'll look at the word count, and then I will cut 10% of the word count. So sometimes, if it's a short paragraph, that might just be like a couple of words, but it might be, hundreds of words if I'm working on a longer document. And I'll keep doing that. I'll take the new document and try to cut it by 10% until I just can't cut anymore without changing the meaning. Because I think a lot of it is just practice, figuring out. I tend to write really long. I tend to use more words than are necessary in my first drafts. So then, since I know that about myself, I'll go back and reread an email once I notice that it's gotten way too long and see what I can cut. And I almost always find stuff that I didn't really need to say, or that I could say in a much more concise way. But unfortunately, I think one of the answers to that is practice, practice, practice.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would reiterate that. I am a big fan of hack and slash writing and just trying to cut with abandon. So and also in multimodal approaches. So trying to kind of break out of just one mode of writing. I really enjoy writing, trying to write long and then printing it off and then taking a red pen to it and just, cutting sentences, moving things around, and then typing that and kind of rinsing and repeating. I think can be a really effective strategy. I think a lot of times in order to write succinctly, you do have to write the opposite of that. You have to write, verbosely. You have to write something that's going to be, 2, 3, 4 times longer than what the finished product is going to be, and then kind of cut back. And that's how you bring in that clarity, because you kind of trim off all the fat and the things that are unnecessary.
And part of that kind of gets, oh, sorry, you should
no,
finish
go ahead. I saw a question had come through the chat, but we can get to that.
I was just going to say that part of the reason that I think writing long and then cutting is an effective mode is that it kind of gets towards some of the theory behind how writing functions in our brains, which is just the idea that writing is not so much a recording of our thoughts, but writing itself is a thinking activity. So, you might not know exactly what you're trying to say when you sit down to write something, and it's only after you've written it that you've figured it out. And then once you figured it out, you can figure out how to say it, as concisely as possible. So yeah, writing is not just a matter of recording what you have already thought. You create new thought through the process.
Awesome. Thank you all. So we are getting some questions through the chat that we'll get to. I think we're going to cover them as well as we go through. But just real quick, what are the most common grammar mistakes that you see when people are first kind of diving into this topic area? And I know I'm very guilty of overusing the passive voice. So sorry, guys. I get really nervous.
It's not technically a mistake. It's just not always the best choice. I think comma errors are the thing I see the most often.
I agree.
People using commas where they're not supposed to be, or not using them where they are supposed to be. The comma rules are actually not that complicated, it's a finite list of rules, but I think people, personally, I was never formally taught grammar in K-12 education. I had to kind of figure it out when I was in grad school, teach myself at that point. So it's totally understandable, and sometimes we choose to break those comma rules on purpose, but I think most of the time I'm seeing them, they're mistakes, not conscious choices to break the rules.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. That's one of the main things I correct is comma usage, and what I try usually to teach alongside that is misusing commas is about not understanding or not being conscious of clauses, of the different types of clauses and how they
work together.
How they work together and how they are distinct from each other sometimes. And so if you know the roles of clauses, independent clauses, subordinate clauses, etc., then comma usage will be easy. But sometimes it does take going back to just understanding what clauses are. Yeah. And you can do that with basic internet searches. It's just about knowing what to look for. Mm-hmm. And once you know that, I'd say I'd add in, like I said, reiterate the active-passive thing, but also a little quibble of mine is let's often, let's say semicolons, for example. Like, if you don't know how to use a semicolon, you usually almost never need to use one. They're kind of, this weird thing that you could do sometimes if you want, but they're almost never necessary. Mm-hmm. So my takeaway, tip for today might be, if you're not totally confident in it, just use a period usually.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people aren't confident. Like, I think a lot of people have anxiety about the semicolon, but it again comes down to this understanding the same basic building blocks of the sentence, the same clauses that you need to know for using commas. And we talk about that in the business writing course. There's a lesson on that. So
yeah, I did really like, when I'm looking at all of these questions that have come in, I was I was really interested because I know that a lot of these questions are taught in either course. And so it's nice to know that we're getting, the content is getting to what a lot of people are curious about, for sure. So how does technical writing help with items like grants and contracts and those types of things?
This is Rich. Can I jump in and start on that one? I think technical writing is really invaluable for a lot of those, like standard operating procedures especially, can be, can kind of require some technical writing as a background. When I think a lot of times, just because I've done a lot of work on our course, how it applies, and so I would say the course that we offer, the non-credit class, is kind of a crash course in technical writing. So you kind of learn the basics of the genre, and the thing that's useful about applying that knowledge, just kind of a more generalized knowledge of technical writing, to things like grants and SOPs and contracts, is that you're going to learn skills that kind of relate to all those different categories in one way or another, even if you're not specifically working on those documents in the class. Some of the skills should be transferable because, at its core, technical writing is very much about removing any unnecessary information and really just getting at the heart of the things. So if you think about instruction manuals, for example, a good instruction manual doesn't make you read through paragraphs of information in order to put your, new dresser together, or in order to, change out a part on your dishwasher, or whatever process it is that you might be working on. Good instruction manuals they just provide what you need to get the job done. And one of the examples I use a lot in my class is actually IKEA instruction manuals, which are very divisive and contain no writing whatsoever, but they can do a good job at helping you put together your furniture because they've spent a lot of time focusing on how to distill relatively complex information into the simplest form possible. And I think that those skills, those are just good writing skills that will help you no matter what documents you're working on.
And that kind of gets to our next question, which is, how do you best organize information, and how do you go about maybe structuring? What are some sort of top tips that people should keep in mind when they're thinking about structuring their documents?
To me, I think a lot of that would come down to remembering that writing is a process, and that to me, it doesn't make sense to organize before you know exactly what you're organizing. So to me, the organization is a little bit of a later stage in the writing process. And I mean, we say writing process, and I think a lot of people think back to maybe like what their high school English teachers made them do in writing an essay, but we all have writing processes for everything we write. I mean, sometimes even text messages, right? Like I'll go back through and make sure that I actually wrote what I wanted to write and that I don't need to clarify anything, but I certainly do it with emails. I'll write the email and then kind of read back through, and a lot of the times I'll copy and paste paragraphs around into a different order so that the information is organized in the way that actually makes the most sense for the reader. And I think the same thing applies for more technical documents as well. I mean, you might start with kind of a rough outline of how you want to organize the information, stuff that you know needs to come at the beginning, stuff that you know won't happen until the end. But I think it's important to kind of fine tune that as you're going through your writing process, whether it's for a short email or for a longer document.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I would also add, a good rule of thumb is to conceive of your paragraph as having one main purpose, and one main purpose or one main idea. And then really no matter what you're writing, the paragraph is your main unit of organization. And so if you can execute one paragraph and deliver on the idea in that paragraph, then it becomes a matter of sequencing your paragraphs correctly. And I think I would also add, in technical and business writing, it's not uncommon for everything to be labeled. When you move on to a new section, use headings, use subheadings. to label the sections for yourself as well as for your reader, that I clearly identify, what they're going to read, basically. So don't be afraid to just label things as you go along. That also creates a readable document, something that someone could flip through and identify quickly what's there, and maybe if they want to skip forward too, they can, depending on how they'll use it. So those would be my 2 tips.
Awesome, thank you. We did just have a question come in that I think is interesting, and Rich can touch upon some of the marketing pieces that you bring in, which is, the question is, how do I work with an organization that doesn't have a style guide? But I think, more broadly, when you're thinking about business writing and with technical writing, if you're working with an organization, how do you go about creating a standard voice or something that's sort of consistent throughout all of your documents?
Yeah, I can kind of start with that, because that's something that we've actually worked on quite a bit here at Workspace. It can be tough, but it can also be a really great opportunity. So depending on the nature of your organization, it can be a good opportunity to create those documents. So I do marketing work here at Oregon State, and we have a style guide for the university, but each unit kind of has their own style, and we were able to create what that looks like, and we were able to kind of create what our voice and our flavor of it might be. And the way we would go about that is to kind of look at what a lot of the documents that we've had in the past have looked like, what it is we're trying to capture, what it is that peer institutions are doing or peer groups on campus, and then kind of building off of that. And a lot of it is just about familiarizing yourself with the content of that organization. And I think that this is kind of a general approach. There were also questions about writing in areas where you're not an expert, and breaking into new content areas. And really it just comes down to research. So you try to research as much as possible, read as much as possible of the existing content, and then kind of base your own style off of that, or at least that's been my approach when coming into new positions where I may be unfamiliar with the subject matter to a certain extent.
And another thing you can do is that depending on what industry you're in, there are kind of some, they're not always like enforced industry standards, but many types of organizations within a given industry will use the same style guide. To me, the key is consistency. That whatever style guide you use, whether you choose to adopt an existing style guide that's out there already, like AP style or MLA or whatever it is, that you're consistent every time, especially with public-facing documents. And then, once you've sort of settled on what that consistent style guide is, that it's communicated with everybody in the office who's producing content, especially, again, that will be public-facing.
That's great. Thank you. The second to last question, I think, is one of the most common ones that we get for the tech writing course. So how does this tech writing course help someone get started in the industry, particularly if they have an educational background, but maybe they don't have the professional experience?
I'll kind of jump in on that one. This is Rich. And I will say that, like I said before, the technical writing course that PACE offers right now is really a crash course in tech writing. And so if you're looking to get started as a technical writer, then I would say it's a good place to get your feet wet. We've had people contact us in the past, and they're like, hey, I have a degree in English, or I have a degree in, whatever their degree might be in. And I want to be a technical writer. Will this course let me do that? And the quick answer to that is no. It's not really the purpose of the course to guarantee you a job. That's what technical writing degrees are for. This is, that's my daughter, Lucy. She feels very adamantly about that. The purpose of this course is more to kind of show you what technical writing looks like and show you the possibilities that exist and allow you to try out some technical writing documents on your own and get some feedback from an expert instructor. So I think that that's really the value of our technical writing course is to kind of allow you. And I will say there are people who have gone on to do jobs in technical writing after taking this course, but it requires a lot of initiative and a lot of self-starting because it's not a degree. So it's more, like a lot of other things, it's about what you put into it as far as what you get out, but it's a really good relatively low stakes environment to kind of try out technical writing and see if it's something that you're interested in and get some feedback on your work from an expert instructor.
Great. And hi, Lucy. So one of the questions that we've had that I actually really love is if you guys could each maybe give your favorite place. It could either be a book or a website or anything for somebody who's like really wanting to dive deeper into this topic, maybe just references that people can go to.
I'm going to go first, and hopefully I'm not stealing anybody's. I would say the Purdue OWL, so OWL standing for Online Writing Lab. They have a really extensive list of pages on everything from how to use grammar correctly to how to cite sources in different styles to how to use passive voice. It's how to write a memo. It's different than taking a class where you're going to get actual feedback from an instructor like the classes that we offer, but it's a really good reference point that I use sometimes if I'm working in a genre that I'm not familiar with. So yeah, the from Purdue University Online Writing Lab. And if you Google that, you will find it.
Awesome. Thank you. Sam?
Yeah, I have two answers for that. I have in the past used a book called Writing Well for Business Success. It's by Sandra Lamb. And I mostly endorse everything in that book. It's written for a popular audience. It's not academic at all. And it has just some nice pieces of advice throughout. It's very accessible. What I would also add, and I also would endorse Purdue's OWL site as well. That's the most widely used, writing reference source, probably, among U.S. academies pretty easily, I would say, to the point where we don't often actually have students buy books much anymore because there's so much good content online. But anyway, the other piece of advice I'd have is that I'd avoid books that talk about writing in absolutes.
Yes.
Writing is always contextual, and the rules for it are always contextual. There's almost never universal rules that would apply to every single situation. And so if you're having to choose between several, choose ones that understand that philosophically, that language is contextual.
Thank you. Rich, do you mind jumping?
I would agree. This is Rich. I was going to say I would agree with both of those. I find with, Google can be your best friend, especially if you're good at evaluating what a quality source is. There are lots of great blog posts out there and articles on writing kind of for whatever your specific issue is. One of the questions I often get asked in the technical writing class is a textbook that I would recommend because a lot of times people kind of want to dive in and find out a little bit more. And the textbook I've used when I've taught the 4-credit version is called The Essentials of Technical Communication. It's from Oxford University Press. It's by Elizabeth Tabot and Sam Draga. It's a really excellent technical writing book because I think it strikes a good tone and things like that. It's a little pricey. I think it's like $50, but you can probably pick up an older edition of it used somewhere for a much lower price.
Awesome. And this is Paula, who is absolutely not a writing expert, but one of the places that I've gone to actually for questions, especially around trying to write content. And I've seen some of the questions that have been coming in are maybe around blogs or online sort of presence. There's a huge resource in podcasts. So Grammar Girl actually has a podcast called Quick and Dirty Tips, and they're really quick overviews of different subjects, which I agree Google is great, but sometimes you just kind of want to hear somebody walk you through it. And so I've been turning to those when I've had questions and found them really useful as well. So I wanted, just for the sake of time, I know we've gotten, like I said, we had around, I think, over 400 questions that were submitted. And I think this is indicative of how popular these courses both are. And so we've been talking a lot about these classes. Our goal here is always to get you the best information for what your needs are. So business writing runs January 6th to February 2nd. Claire, do you mind just giving a quick overview of what is covered in that class? I know, so both of the classes are instructor-led, which means that you're going to be getting feedback from one of our instructors on all of your documents. You're going to get really coaching to be able to walk you through. The class sizes are capped at, I think, between 25 and 30. So you're going to get exposure to other people and discussion boards and things like that, but they're not giant classes. You are going to get one-on-one attention from your instructor, which I think is important. So yeah, Claire, do you mind going over the business writing course?
Yeah, so it covers, I feel like, kind of a lot in the 4 weeks that it runs. It covers some kind of basic grammar stuff. It's got a grammar self-assessment, so you can kind of see where you're at with grammar and technical languagey stuff. But then a lot of it's also focused on rhetoric and audience awareness, kind of the bigger picture stuff. And then there's a lot of stuff with how to actually apply that big picture philosophical, how you write for your audience stuff in actual practice documents. And we talk about, how to format stuff. We talk about U-attitude, which is kind of a business writing term for audience awareness. So it's kind of balanced between the bigger picture and then the practical application of that, the bigger ideas.
Awesome. And Sam, you're our instructor for technical writing. Do you mind giving a quick overview of what that class is going to look like? Starting, the January section is already full. Both of these classes tend to fill up. Technical writing, the next section is now open for February. So Sam, do you mind giving a quick overview of what students can expect in that course?
I think Rich would be more apt to do that for now.
Okay, Rich, do you
He's
mind?
there.
Sure, there might be some screaming in the background. Yeah, the technical writing course, like I said, it really is kind of a crash course in technical writing as a genre. So it's a really good overview. So if you think technical writing is something that you're interested in getting into and it is a really good emerging field, then it can be a good chance to do that. Or if you just want to build some more advanced writing skills, it can be good for that as well.
Awesome. Thank you. And thanks for being a champ and going over this webinar while also having your baby there. That's brave man. So again, thank you all so much for joining us. Here's the information for the business writing and the technical writing. Like I said before, you're going to get a copy of the slide and a recording of the webinar. You can reach out to us at workspace.oregonstate.edu to get a full overview of all of our courses in our catalog and to register for either of those classes. Our email is workspace@oregonstate.edu. Our phone number is listed there. And I encourage you to sign up for our newsletter as well. So our newsletter will have this webinar. It'll have information about future courses. It'll also have information around other content generation. And so we've gotten so many questions here that I think we're going to have to try and address them further on down the line. So we'll be sending out some more content around what people can expect and maybe tips and tricks for folks that are looking for more information. So I wanted to thank you all again so much for joining us. And dedicating some of your time this Friday before holiday break. And from all of us here at Oregon State, thanks again and go Beats.
Thank you.